Thanks you at home for joining us this hour. Really happy to have you here. So this was January 17th last year. On January 17th last year, just to get your head around what was going on that date, that was just 3 days before Joe Biden was set to be inaugurated as the new president of the United States. Inauguration day was January 20th. This was January 17th. 11 days before January 17th was January 6th, when the pro-Trump mob stormed into Congress to try to prevent Congress from certifying Joe Biden's election as the new president. So on January 17th last year, it is a week and a half since January 6th, and it is 3 days until the inauguration. And on that date, January 17th, here is a text message that was sent to Donald Trump's White House Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. It says, quote, "Mark, in seeing what's happening so quickly and reading about the Dominion lawsuits attempting to stop any meaningful investigation, we are at a point of no return in saving our republic! Exclamation point, exclamation point. Our, all caps, last hope is invoking martial law. Please urge to President to do so." So it's 3 days before Joe Biden's inauguration. White House Chief of Staff is getting this text message urging President Trump to invoke martial law, spelled M-A-R-S-H-A-L-L, misspelled, as if the person sending this law thinks there's a Marshall's Law and maybe also a Ross Dress for Less law, possibly a TJ Maxx law that could be invoked as well. What he means is martial law, M-A-R-T-I-A-L, as in suspend the Constitution and put the military in charge to rule by force. Our last hope is invoking martial law. Please urge to President to do so. This is 3 days before the inauguration. Call out the troops, use military force, use weapons of war against the American public in order to stop the inauguration of the new president and instead put Trump in power. And you know, this is a message not sent by the White House Chief of Staff. It's a message sent to him. And so maybe you're thinking, you know, I bet the White House Chief of Staff gets all kinds of weird spam text messages from overeager Trump supporters. I mean, whoever sent this doesn't even know how to spell martial law, so how serious could this be? But this text message was not from some rando who just guessed the phone number of the White House Chief of Staff. No, this text message was from a sitting member of the United States Congress, Republican Congressman Ralph Norman of South Carolina. On January 17th last year, 3 days before Biden's inauguration, Congressman Ralph Norman was texting Trump's White House Chief of Staff to urge President Trump to call out the U.S. military to use the military against civilians in order to keep Trump in power. Congressman Norman was a sitting member of Congress when he sent that. He is still one now. Ralph Norman was just reelected to Congress in South Carolina's 5th Congressional District. And he was reelected by a lot. He was reelected by like a 2-to-1 margin. And marveling about the seditious radicalism of a member of Congress, somebody who wants to suspend the Constitution and keep their guy in power by force, using military force to do it. I mean, marveling at some member of Congress being that far out there. I mean, that's something we all get to do from time to time. But right now, knowing this is what Ralph Norman was advocating for to the White House, right? Suspend the Constitution, put troops in the streets, take power by force. Knowing he was advocating that is one thing. Knowing that he and his party are going back to Congress as the new majority party there for next year, that feels like something different. Because what are they going to do with their real power when they really have it? That text from Congressman Ralph Norman to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows comes to us tonight from reporter Hunter Walker, along with Josh Kovensky and Emine Uje at the news website Talking Points Memo. They've posted a series of articles tonight based on thousands of text messages they have obtained. Thousands of text messages that they say were sent by and to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows between election night, November 2020, and Biden's inauguration day in January 2021. These are thousands of text messages that were turned over to the January 6th investigation in Congress. And Talking Points Memo has obtained them, and they're reporting tonight, based on this trove of texts, that as unsettling as that message was from Congressman Ralph Norman, he was far from the only sitting member of Congress who was exchanging text messages with Mark Meadows about what could be done to keep Trump in power despite the election results. 34 Republican members of Congress were reportedly texting about it with Mark Meadows. And Hunter Walker and his colleagues have published many of those messages tonight. Now, I should note that we have not reviewed the original text messages ourselves. We are just reviewing what has been reported by Talking Points memo. That said, we have reached out to both Mark Meadows and Congressman Ralph Norman for comment tonight, but thus far we have not heard back. I can tell you that when Talking Points memo reached Congressman Norman himself on his cell phone this morning, when they reached him and they asked about his text calling for martial law, Congressman Norman told them, quote, "It's been 2 years." And he asked them to send him a copy of his text message for him to review. After TPM forwarded Congressman Norman a copy of the message, they say, quote, "We did not receive any further response from the congressman." I should also note that some of the texts between Mark Meadows and members of Congress have been reported on previously, and some of them have been released publicly by the January 6th investigation, which is the entity that obtained them in the first place. But seeing them all in one place at TPM tonight, it really is quite something. I mean, particularly because Republicans are about to take power in the House, which means they're imminently about to shut down the work of the January 6th investigation. I mean, in addition to Congressman Ralph Norman of South Carolina calling for martial law, calling for the U.S. military to install Trump in power, even after January 6th happened, there's also a Republican congressman from Tennessee telling White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that Republican legislatures should just overrule the vote in their states and proclaim Trump the winner. Congressman Mark Green of Tennessee told the White House Chief of Staff that should happen in various Republican-controlled states because he described a guest on Newsmax as saying that was a legal possibility. Also, a North Carolina congressman pushing the same strategy. Congressman Greg Murphy of North Carolina, pushing the same strategy as Green, cut and pasted from a right-wing website in his case. Also, another North Carolina congressman suggesting to Mark Meadows, in this case it was Ted Budd of North Carolina, he suggested to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that the voting machines had all been rigged by George Soros. That congressman actually not only is going back to Congress, he's going back to Congress as a senator, because he just got promoted to U.S. Senator in last month's election in North Carolina, Ted Budd. Also, right-wing favorite Congressman Paul Gosar of Arizona. He sent the White House Chief of Staff a link to supposed evidence of election rigging. He got this supposed evidence, and he forwarded the citation to Mark Meadows in the White House. The blog that he got the information was called Some Swear Word Told Me. Word that starts with B and rhymes with Mitch. Some blank told me. That's the name of the blog that he cited to the White House Chief of Staff to justify whatever means were necessary to keep Trump in power. Some B told me. Congressman Jim Jordan of Ohio texting a detailed plan for how Vice President Mike Pence could overturn the election and proclaim Trump to have been reelected when he wasn't. Jim Jordan is expected to become chairman of the House Judiciary Committee next year. And in lots of cases, there's no record of Mark Meadows ever replying to these messages, but in some cases he does. And there are also references that suggest he was communicating with many of these members of Congress separately on encrypted messaging apps. And those would be messages that, as far as we know, the January 6th investigation has not yet obtained. Congressman Scott Perry of Pennsylvania, he exchanged so many texts with Mark Meadows full of Baroque conspiracy theories about Italian satellites rigging voting machines and the CIA director being in cahoots with the British government to steal the election for Biden. Why would the CIA work with the Brits to steal? There was so much of that from Republican Congressman Scott Perry that Talking Points Memo has a whole separate article tonight dedicated just to Scott Perry's texts to and from the White House Chief of Staff. Congressman Scott Perry chairs something called the House Freedom Caucus, which is a powerful group of far-right Republicans whose power is set to grow next year under the Republicans' razor-thin House majority. It may also be the entity that determines who gets to be the next Republican Speaker of the House. We also reached out to Congressman Scott Perry of Pennsylvania for comment tonight, but we have not yet heard back. Again, Many of these text messages have been reported before, some of them in drips and drabs. But the difference tonight is that we now know, A, we can see all these text messages together, right? But also these guys are going to be in charge of the U.S. Congress, in charge of the U.S. House in just a few weeks, which means, among other things, as I said, that the January 6th investigation, which first unearthed these text messages, that's going to be shut down because, of course, if you were a Republican who had been involved in this stuff during the January 6th era, of course you would like to shut down that investigation. Among other things, that expected timeline means that the January 6th investigation has a very short window of time in which to finish their work and publish their findings to the public. The January 6th investigators reportedly met last night to discuss whether they're going to make criminal referrals to the Justice Department and how many and of whom. NBC News reports that the committee has yet to make a final decision on that. The committee's also reviewing a draft of its final report, which is expected to be released next week, next Wednesday specifically, the 21st. Merry Christmas, everybody. The final publication of that January 6th investigation report may involve a formal public presentation by the investigators, which presumably would happen sometime around the time the report is finalized and published, which is expected Wednesday, January 21st. Anyway, we are waiting for details on that. But meanwhile, the prosecutions in court for January 6th-related crimes and alleged crimes, those prosecutions are also entering a really crucial stage, not only crucial for the defendants, but crucial for the country in terms of accountability and getting the history right and getting the story straight about what happened and what crimes were committed on that day. We, of course, just got seditious conspiracy convictions for two leaders of the pro-Trump paramilitary group called the Oath Keepers. Its founder and one other member of the Oath Keepers were found guilty of seditious conspiracy and plotting violence for January 6th to try to keep Trump in office. That was the seditious conspiracy conviction that's already happened, though. There's two more seditious conspiracy trials on their way. Today, there were opening statements. In the next round of Oath Keepers prosecutions, this is yet another trial on seditious conspiracy charges for four more members of the Oath Keepers, including some of those who were seen entering the Capitol on January 6th in that unnerving military stack formation. We've got another seditious conspiracy trial coming starting next week that'll involve members of the Proud Boys, another pro-Trump right-wing paramilitary group. But here's something to keep an eye on when it comes to charges against January 6 defendants. When you had those convictions of the Oath Keepers on seditious conspiracy, right? That's the headline charge that got all the most attention, and for good reason. But when you got those seditious conspiracy convictions of two members of the Oath Keepers, you should know that those two members of the Oath Keepers and also all of the other fellow defendants who were charged in that same trial, they were all also convicted of a different felony, obstructing an official proceeding. In other words, they were convicted of a felony charge for preventing Congress or trying to prevent Congress from doing its job that day, which was certifying the presidential election. And that charge, obstructing an official proceeding, that hasn't just been used against these organized paramilitary groups like the Oath Keepers. About 300 different defendants from January 6th have been charged under that specific felony statute, obstruction of an official proceeding. That specific statute, obstruction of an official proceeding, has also been seen by many legal experts as one of the most likely felony charges that could be brought against Donald Trump himself if he were ever to be charged personally in connection with the January 6th attack. That's why it's worth sort of memorizing that phrase, obstruction of an official proceeding. It's worth keeping an eye on that as a specific felony charge that has, again, been used hundreds of times and has been used to get hundreds of convictions thus far against January 6 defendants. Because in a Washington, D.C. federal appeals court today, a panel of 3 federal appeals court judges started considering whether that specific charge should essentially be nullified when it comes to January 6th, whether it shouldn't be allowed to use that charge against January 6 defendants. At a lower level, at the district court level in the federal court system in D.C., there's one Trump-appointed judge who has ruled that that felony charge, that obstruction of an official proceeding charge, can't be used against January 6 defendants. Lots of other judges, including judges in that same federal court, in that same D.C. District Court, have said it's fine to use that charge, and in fact have overseen trials in which it has been used, and it has been used to secure convictions. But there is this one Trump judge who says it shouldn't be used. And when that Trump-appointed judge ruled that way, the Justice Department appealed. And so today it was the next highest level of court. It was a federal appeals court, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which heard oral arguments on whether or not that specific felony charge can essentially be obviated for January 6 defendants. And that could have very wide consequences for everybody all the way down the line, not only people who have already been convicted of that charge, but people who are facing charges on that, facing that felony charge, and potentially the consideration of whether or not a charge like that might be used against people who are at the very top of the alleged conspiracy. So again, oral arguments on that in the appeals court in Washington, D.C. today. Those appeals court judges can rule basically whenever they feel like it in terms of when they want to give their ruling, but a lot is hinging on their ruling. In terms of January 6th, it's sort of crunch time right now on the legal front and also for the January 6th investigation in Congress, which, as we know, is in its final weeks.